Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Welcome to this first session of my lectures on Advaita Academy. As I start, let me first thank the people at Advaita Academy for giving me this chance to share my knowledge of Advaita Vedanta with a broader audience. Let me introduce myself briefly. My name is Vidya Shankar. I am a chemical engineer by training and profession, but I come from a very traditional family that has a lot of background with the tradition of Advaita Vedanta, and it has always been something that's part of my background and my personal philosophical quest as well. So in this series of lectures, I am going to speak in English, which is a very modern way of talking about Vedanta. And some of you might find my accent to be very Indian, some of you might find my accent to be very American. That's because I've lived in the United States for half my life. So my apologies ahead of time if you find some of my accents and my manner of expression to be a little something that you're not used to. But throughout, my endeavor is going to be to base all these discussions in a very traditional text-oriented format. I will be, for the next few set of lectures, be focusing on the Taittiriya Upanishad Bhashya, that is a commentary on the Taittiriya Upanishad of Adi Shankaracharya. Now, why Taittiriya Upanishad? Why not some other text? There are at least 3 or 4 reasons I can cite. Firstly, the Taittiriya Upanishad is part of the Krishna Yajurveda, which happens to be my own family's Veda tradition. And as I have learned to recite the Taittiriya Upanishad, what I will be doing as part of these lectures will also be reciting the parts, anuvakas, and we will take them in terms of logical units of discussion, and we will be going through some detail and explanatory comments that I will add based on the commentary of Adi Shankaracharya. Another reason is that Adi Shankaracharya's Veda Shakha itself is also supposed to have been the Taittiriya Shakha. There is a traditional account that says that when Sureshwaracharya composed his Vartikas, he chose the Taittiriya Upanishad commentary because that was Adi Shankara's own Veda branch, and then he chose the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad commentary because that was his own Veda branch, because Sureshwaracharya was from a Shukla Yajurveda background. There is a third reason, which is that the Taittiriya Upanishad has a very important place in the whole foundation of Advaita Vedanta thought and tradition. Before I get into that, let me provide, for the sake of the general audience, a brief background on how Upanishads are assigned to Vedas. Many of you who have some amount of familiarity with Vedantic tradition and thought would know that the Vedanta tradition starts off from what is called Prasthana Trayi. Prasthana is starting point, Trayi, 3 starting points. So there are 3 different starting points that meet together to form the Vedanta tradition. These are the Shruti Prasthana, Smriti Prasthana, and the Nyaya Prasthana. Shruti is the heard tradition. That is the Veda. Specifically for the purposes of Vedanta, the Shruti texts that are central are the Upanishad texts. Then we have the Smriti Prasthana. The most fundamental Smriti text that is most often cited is the Bhagavad Gita. But Smriti is not limited to the Bhagavad Gita. In fact, all of the Mahabharata and other texts, including Dharma Shastra texts, can all be part of what is called Smriti Prasthana. Smriti in Sanskrit language means memory. So this is the remembered tradition, not just the heard tradition. And then there is the Nyaya Prasthana, or the logical starting point. And the logical starting point is the Brahma Sutra of Badarayana, on which Shankaracharya wrote commentary. And other Vedanta teachers after him also wrote their commentaries. So, all schools of Vedanta, in fact, any traditional teacher gets to be called a Vedantin, or a school gets to be called Vedanta only if its primary commentator started writing commentaries on the Brahma Sutra and then on the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita. So these are the three starting points of Vedanta, and that is called Prasthanatrayi. Of these, the central, the foundational starting point still remains the Shruti. Smriti is derivative of Shruti, and it encompasses the remembered tradition that is derivative of the heard tradition. And the Nyaya Prasthana, which is the Brahma Sutra, is derivative of both Shruti and Smriti, because what Badarayana tries to do in the Brahma Sutras is put together a self-consistent logical structure that takes the source texts in the Shruti and the Smriti and builds up a philosophical foundation, which then becomes Vedanta. So the Shruti texts are foundational for the other two starting points as well. Of the Shruti texts, there are multiple Upanishads that belong to the four Vedas. So again, everyone would have heard, or you would know, that the Vedas are four in number: Rig Veda, Yajur Veda, Sama Veda, and Atharvana Veda. Within the Yajur Veda, there are two huge branches, that is called the Krishna Yajus and the Shukla Yajus. You would have also heard of the Veda being described as Trayi, or threefold. And in that sense, you will often see references to Rig Yajus Sama. The Atharva is kind of left out. It does not mean that the Atharva Veda has lower status. What it means is that this threefold division refers to the content and the structure, the morphological form of the content of the Veda. So the Rig Veda is essentially the collection of the Veda that is heavy in the Rija, that is verse. The Yajur Veda is the collection of the Veda that is heavy on the Yajus, which is prose sentences. The Sama Veda is that content. The Saman essentially refers to the hymns of the Rig Veda that are not recited the way the Rig Veda is recited, but sung with a melodic form associated with it. This should not be confused with Indian classical music of either Hindustani or Carnatic varieties. The song structure of the Sama has its own integrity, has its own logic, has its own rules and a tradition behind it that is far more ancient than the classical musical traditions of India. So why is the Atharva left out? That is because most of the content of the Atharva Veda is also hymns and a few sentences. So when you look at it in terms of poetry, prose and song, that is what the three forms of Vedic content are. When you look at the Veda in terms of separate collections, then you have the Rig Veda, which is heavy in the Rig, Yajur Veda, which is heavy in the Yajus or the prose, Sama Veda, which is heavy on the singing structure, and Atharva Veda, which contains a collection of Rig that is not included in the Rig Veda but has a separate content in itself. Now, among these four Vedas, we have what are called the Samhita, which consists primarily of mantras, most of which are used for the ritual tradition, the Vaidika ritual tradition, what is called the Karma Kanda. Then we have the Brahmanas and the Aranyakas, and typically the Upanishad texts, which are foundational for Vedanta, are mostly found in the Brahmana and the Aranyaka portions of the Veda. There are a couple of exceptions. The most important being the Ishavasya Upanishad, which is actually part of the Samhita portion and not the Brahmana portion of the Shukla Yajurveda. Now, why this division of the Yajurveda itself into Krishna and Shukla? The Krishna Yajurveda is that recension of the Yajurveda where the mantra and Brahmana sections are all found interspersed with each other. They are mixed up in terms of their textual structure. And because they are not separated out, unlike in say the Rig Veda where the Rig Samhita is all hymns, it's all mantras. The Brahmanas and the Aranyakas of the Rig Veda recensions tend to be independent of the mantras. So they are well demarcated. In the Krishna Yajurveda, they are not as easily demarcated. There is what is called the Taittiriya Samhita and the Taittiriya Brahmana and the Taittiriya Aranyaka, but in each one of these portions you will find mantra and Brahmana sections interspersed with each other. Now what in the Krishna Yajurveda itself, the Taittiriya is the most prevalent, most widespread branch, and the Taittiriya branch of the Krishna Yajurveda is what gives rise to the Taittiriya Upanishad. The Shukla Yajurveda has the Samhita and the Brahmana portions well separated out, just like in the Rig Veda, for instance. That is the primary difference between the Shukla Yajurveda and the Krishna Yajurveda. When you go to study the contents of the Veda, you will find that they share a lot of common material. Both the Krishna Yajurveda and Shukla Yajurveda, for instance, start with the same Ishet Vorjetva hymn. Now, what is the difference between verse and prose? It's very simple. Verse has poetic meter built into it. Prose does not. Prose consists of long sentences. So let me just recite a couple of instances. So the first verse of the Rig Veda is Agnimi Ile Purohitam Yajnasya Deva Mritvijam Hota Aram Ratnadhatamam. There is poetic meter built into here. 3 lines of 8 syllables each. can also be thought of as the first line has 16 syllables and the second line has 8 syllables. That is a poetic meter. Now there are multiple meters. When you start identifying the structure of poetry, that is what gives rise to the multiple Vaidika meters that are Gayatri, Ushnik, Anushtup, Brihati, Pankti, Trishtup, Jagati. These are the most important 7 meters that are found in the Rig Veda content. The Yajurveda, on the other hand, has long prose sentences. So, for instance, if you have heard the Rudram being chanted, which is probably one of the most widely recited portions of the Yajurveda, you will see this sentence. Yo Rudro Agnav Yo Apsuya Oshadishu Yo Rudro Vishwa Bhuvana Vivesha Tasmai Rudra Yanamo Astu. That is a sentence. There is no poetic structure that you can identify in a sentence like this. It says, just like you would say in a sentence in normal languages used for human communication, you would say, that Rudra who has entered into the waters, into the fire, into the herbs that grow on earth, that Rudra who has entered into the entire universe, to that Rudra we offer our salutations. Right? So that is a sentence, not a verse in structure. So this is the primary difference between Rig and Yajus. The content of the Samaveda is almost completely identical in its verse content with the Rig Veda. There are only about 70 odd verses that are found in Samaveda collection that are not found in the Rig Veda. The rest of the Samaveda is already present as Rigs in the Rig Veda, but in the Samaveda they are not recited like in the Rig Veda, but they are sung, as I mentioned before. So each of these Vedas and the Atharva Veda as well contributes its own Upanishads that are now put together to form the structure of Vedanta. There are literally today hundreds of Upanishads that are assigned to these 4 Vedas, but when you look at the foundational structure of Vedanta, starting from the Brahma Sutras and going through the various Advaita, Visishta Advaita, Dvaita Advaita, Bheda Bheda and the Dvaita traditions, you will find that most of the references given to Shruti are from a few central Upanishadic texts. These are what are called the principal Upanishads in today's discourse. These are, from the Rig Veda, we have the Aitareya Upanishad and the Kaushitaki Upanishad. From the Krishna Yajurveda, we have the Taittiriya Upanishad and the Kathopanishad. From the Shukla Yajurveda, you have the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad and the Ishavasya Upanishad. From Samaveda, we have Chandogya Upanishad and the Kena Upanishad. And from the Atharva Veda, we have Mundaka, Prashna and Mandukya. These tend to be the most important Upanishads that are cited again and again. Other important Upanishads are the Shvetashvatara Upanishad, Jabala Upanishad, and a few other Upanishads that are smaller in size and they touch upon very specific issues that are referenced but not as frequently in the structure of the Vedantic tradition. So these few Upanishads have become foundational, most important, and the commentaries on these Upanishads by Adi Shankaracharya are studied independently. So why does the Taittiriya Upanishad take a very important place is because of the following. When you look at the Brahma Sutras, which form the logical structure, which puts the logical superstructure around the other 2 prasthanas, the way the Brahma Sutras are arranged is that each sutra refers to source texts which are called Vishaya Vakyas, or the subject sentences. People have studied the Brahma Sutra and found that in terms of frequency, the largest number of such references come from the Chandogya Upanishad of the Samaveda and the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad of the Shukla Yajurveda. But there are certain key sutras which hold the entire structure of Vedanta together, where the Vishaya Vakyas refer to sentences from the Taittiriya Upanishad. For instance, the very first Brahma Sutra, Athato Brahma Jignasa, and the second Brahma Sutra, Janmadhyasya Yataha. The most important subject matter that is covered in these two sutras, which sets off the whole thinking of Vedantic tradition, refer to Taittiriya Upanishad sentences. So, for instance, the very first sutra, which talks of Brahma Jignasa, refers to the Bhrigu, the third chapter of the Taittiriya Upanishad, where Bhrigu goes to his father Varuna and says, "Teach me Brahman." Adhi hi bhagavo brahmeti. So, teach me Brahman. And Varuna, in the course of replying to Bhrigu and teaching him what Brahman is, says, "Tad brahmeti tad vijijñāsasva." Tad vijijñāsasva is the subject matter of the very first sutra, Brahma Jignasa. Now, what is this Brahman that is to be known? Jignasa refers to a desire to know. It comes from the root, verbal root, which refers to know. Jñātumichha jignasa, a desire to know. The second sutra that says Janmadhyasya Yataha again refers to the Bhrigu, because immediately before telling Bhrigu Tad Vijijñāsasva, Varuna, his father, gives a sort of a foundational definition. Yato va imani bhutani jayante yena jatani jivanti yat prayanti abhisamvishanti tad vijijñāsasva tad brahmeti. Yataha vai imani bhutani jayante. Yato va imani bhutani jayante yena jatani jivanti. Yena jatani jivanti yat prayanti abhisamvishanti iti. Yat prayanti abhisamvishanti iti. Okay? Yena va imani bhutani jayante. Yato va imani bhutani jayante. That from which all these beings are born. Yena jatani jivanti. That by which all these, having born, live. Yat prayanti abhisamvishanti. That into which they enter again after they are done with life. So Brahman refers to that principle from which all beings are born, that by which all beings live, and that into which all beings get resolved. So this is what is referred to Janmadhyasya Yataha. Janmadi asya, of this world, of sentient and insentient beings, Yataha, from which. That is the second sutra. So that again refers to the Taittiriya Upanishad, Bhrigu. So you see, the Taittiriya Upanishad becomes a very foundational text for the starting point of Vedanta itself. Later in the Brahma Sutra, you will see another sutra that says Kamat cha na anumana apeksha. Kamat cha na anumana apeksha. That refers to a sort of an argumentation that is built up in Shankaracharya's commentary against the dualistic Samkhya school. And that says that because of the reference to kama or desire, there is no ground for the Samkhya inference of a dualistic ontology of Purusha as a sentient principle and Prakriti as a material insentient principle. Now, what is this kama? That again refers to a statement in the Anandavalli. So, kamayata bahusyam praja yeti. So, in the Anandavalli, it is said that Brahman, who was at the beginning, desired akamayata. What did he desire, or what did it desire? Bahusyam prajayeti. Bahusyam prajayeya iti. Brahman was one alone at the beginning, and it desired. Now, this desire is a metaphorical desire. May I become many. So, it is this foundational desire that is said to be the impetus from which the manifold universe comes into being from the one Brahman. That is what the sutra Kamachana Anumana Apeksha refers to. It is again a reference back to the Shruti statement in the Taittiriya Upanishad. Another important contribution from the Taittiriya Upanishad is what is called the Ananda Mimamsa. Now, there are references to Brahman as Ananda in other texts as well, but it is the Taittiriya Upanishad which initially defines Brahman as Satyam Jnanam Anantam Brahma. Satyam Jnanam Anantam. The word Ananta means eternal, but at the end of the same chapter, it has an entire discourse on Brahman as Ananda. And that becomes the subject matter of a great deal of discussion in what is called the Anandamayadhikarana in the Brahma Sutra itself. So again, those who have had exposure to Advaita Vedanta in a broad sense would know the formulation of Brahman as Satchidananda. Sat, Chit and Ananda. The Shruti reference for the Ananda portion of this formulation again comes from the Taittiriya Upanishad. So there are multiple reasons why a detailed study of the Taittiriya Upanishad will be very useful. So in this series of lectures, my aim is to go into detail. Along the way, I will point to very specific sentences in Shankaracharya's commentary, go through a little bit of the grammar, go through some of the philosophical arguments being made, why a certain discussion proceeds in a certain way, why is there a sort of a paradox being built up and then resolved. What does that mean for philosophical thinking? What does that mean for the Vedanta tradition itself? How do all these things fit together? That is also going to be a part of this focus, so that although I will be focusing mostly on the Taittiriya Upanishad and going through its commentary, I will also highlight how Shankaracharya weaves all these texts together, because the Vedanta tradition never looks at the Upanishads as standalone texts. It is not just what the Taittiriya Upanishad teaches, it is not just what the Chandogya Upanishad teaches, and it is not just what the Ishavasya Upanishad teaches. It is what all of these texts put together. What do these texts say? That is an important consideration, and I will highlight how Shankaracharya also weaves all these texts together in his Taittiriya Upanishad commentary. So in the next few lectures, I will build upon this theme and highlight how starting from one text one can get an appreciation for the structure of the entire gamut of Vedanta thought. Once we are finished with the Taittiriya Upanishad commentary, we will move on to other topics. So with that, I will close this first session. This is the first weekend of the Navaratri in the year 2014. And so as I conclude, let me just point out that the Navaratri festival is sacred to the goddess. Of course, we have multiple traditions of worshipping the goddess. From a Vedantic perspective, I would like to point listeners to the Kenopanishad, where Uma Haimavati comes in the form of the teacher to the gods, when the gods are wondering who is Brahman. And how Shankaracharya interprets the appearance of Uma Haimavati is as Brahma Vidya. The goddess is the personification of Brahman knowledge, Brahma Vidya. All of Vedanta starts with that Brahma Jignasa, the desire to know about Brahman, the desire to learn Brahma Vidya. It is that Brahma Vidya which is called a goddess. And I would like to conclude with pointing out that this is not something that Shankaracharya comes up with out of his own imagination. The concept of worshipping knowledge as the goddess is of course age-old, but more specifically, the Upanishad texts themselves are also considered as devatas. Those among the listeners, those who have a practice of offering Brahma Yajna, either on a daily basis or at least on a once in a year basis on the day of Upakarma, might remember this. Those who have not been initiated with the Yajnopavita, you might have seen this, or next time pay attention when somebody else performs the Brahma Yajna. You will see certain water oblations being made as a tarpana to Sagam Hirir Devataha Upanishadas Tarpayami, Varunir Devataha Upanishadas Tarpayami. So these sentences will occur as part of the Brahma Yajna. The Brahma Yajna is a yajnam for learning itself, that celebrates and puts Brahman learning at the center of that ritual itself. Because ultimately learning itself is a ritual, and it is through that ritual process that we gain learning, and when we internalize that learning that it then becomes knowledge. Right? So Sagam Hitir Devataha Upanishadas Tarpayami refers to the Sikshavalli of the Taittiriya Upanishad. The Sikshavalli, right at the beginning, has Athatas Sagamhitaya Upanishadam Vyaakhya Syamaha. So Sagamhitaya Upanishadam, the Upanishad of the Sagamhita, that is what is referred to in the Brahma Yajna ritual as Sagamhitir Devataha Upanishadas Tarpayami. So the Upanishad itself is called a Devata. Then Varunir Devataha Upanishadas Tarpayami. So the Varunir Devata refers to the Bhriguvalli. Saishabha Argavi Varuni Vidya Parame Vyoman Pratishtita. So this is Varuni Vidya. That is the Upanishad itself. So these are considered as Devatas to whom we offer just an oblation of water in the Brahma Yajna ritual. So this tradition of considering the Upanishad itself as a Devata, learning knowledge itself as the goddess, is an age-old tradition that comes to us from both the ritual tradition and the knowledge tradition. And that is what Shankaracharya refers to as Uma Haimavati is Brahma Vidya herself. So on this first session, which I am starting in the first weekend of the Navaratri festival this year. I thought I would just highlight that aspect. From the next session onwards, we will go verse by verse, or rather Anuvaka by Anuvaka, starting from the Sikshavalli, which is the first chapter of the Taittiriya Upanishad. Thank you.